Well, if you do have a book, and Glenn, thank you for going and finding one. And welcome, first of all. I was not supposed to be here today. My grandson was supposed to be baptized today, but he got sick. And because of that, they canceled that until the 12th. So I will be out next week, and Brother Dennis is going to be filling in for us next week. And Sean and I will be making our way up to Calvary for his baptism. And it kind of worked out good in that way because that evening we have my daughter-in-law's brother-in-law will be ordained into the ministry at their church. And so we're going to be able to go to both of those in one day rather than having to make two different trips. So it worked out well. If you would right now, turn to session 5. I know that this is not today's lesson, but I want to kind of give a quick review of what we missed. Last week we didn't have Sunday school, so we're in our quarterly. If you remember, we were talking about the book of Exodus, and we were talking about how God chose a man, just a normal guy, who was raised as a baby in Pharaoh's court for 40 years, went out into the desert for 40 years, and then God interceded and said, go back to Israel, go back to Egypt, lead Israel out of there, and you're going to be the one to do it. And so in the meantime, we have looked at how God prepared his heart, prepared Pharaoh's heart, even though every time that Moses would go to Pharaoh, it seemed like that you would read in the scriptures that Pharaoh's heart would what? Harden. He hardened his heart. Either God would do it or he would do it. He would either do it by choice because he did not want to be submissive to the God of Israel, or he would do it because of resentment of they were taking things what he felt like would take away from his empire. And so we're up to this point now. In our last few lessons, we've talked about those things, and we've seen how faith in itself has led Moses, it's led the people of Israel back into a relationship with him, in somewhat of a relationship. Today, I want to kind of just briefly go back in session 5. We're not going to hit on everything, just some highlights. And I don't remember what page it is in your personal study guide, but if you look at it, the title of the lesson in chapter 5, or session 5, was called Power Revealed, and the subcaption would be God Displays His Power. And one of the things is that it was emphasized is that we can find freedom from bondage of slavery, or freedom from bondage of sin. Now, the slavery part comes into play when we're talking about Israel, correct? Because that's what they were seeking, is freedom from slavery. But yet, for us, Jesus Christ, or God, provides us freedom or bondage, freedom from the bondage of sin in our life. And how does He do that? Through Jesus Christ, who came as we talked about last week, He came as a babe, or 2 weeks ago, and He was born of a virgin. He gave Himself to die on the cross. His blood was shed. And then from there, we have the opportunity for salvation. But in this session 5, it covers quite a bit of length. It covers about almost 4.5 chapters, or really 2 chapters, Exodus 14 and through 15. But it goes a little bit more extensive in that. And what we look at is how God uses the miracles He performs to draw the attention of not only the Israelites, but also to the Egyptians of who He really is, His power, His glory, His majesty. Now they are led out of Egypt, so to speak, out of bondage as they're going toward the Red Sea. You see that they come up on the Red Sea, and that's where they camp. And what happens? A pillar of fire and a cloud protects them. 2 things I want to mention here at this point. At this point, up in this, as they're going out, God's presence is in front of them. And now what happens? God's presence is behind them. It's protecting them. And so we get this picture of God's protection all around them, of how He's not only in front of them protecting, but now He's behind them. One of the things I was reading about this as I was going back and reviewing is that usually in the Old Testament, some of the theologians felt like that through the cloud, there would oftentimes, you can read this in scriptures, where there would be thunder and lightning. There would be all kind of, I kind of pictured like this, a violent storm, but yet it was just God expressing His power and His presence to the people. And so they would see that and they would sense it. Notice that a couple of things that it talked about during this lesson, and I don't want to go through every one of them, but I want to go through two in particular, is that God's always in control regardless of what we think. And the second one is this, is that His power, when we see that, our faith can be strengthened. I don't know about you, but sometimes for guidance, we look in other places for, answers to our questions. How many of you have ever had a thought or a problem or situation in your life and you say, well, let me see if I can solve this for myself? And we do that. Or we go to, and Dennis, I'm not picking on you, but let's just go to Dennis and see if he knows the answer, okay? Or let's go to Rusty. Let's go here. Or let's go to Steve and see if we can find the problem. And they don't know any more than we do. I don't mean that bad, guys. I'm just saying that's what we find out, is that spiritually we're all in the same situation. And what is that? We're all sinners. The Bible tells us in Romans that we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And he goes on to say that none are righteous, no, not one. But the amazing thing here is what we find is that we often, when we find out we can't do it for ourselves, who do we go to? God. And we should have went to Him in the first place. So our faith can be strengthened if we just understand that God is still powerful and is always powerful. Well, that brings us up to this session, and I'd challenge you to go back and look at this session 5, because another one of the most interesting things theologians argue about more than anything else is this, is that here they are, they're encamped upon the Red Sea. Some people may call it the Reed Sea or the Red Sea. And as God parts the waters, the Israelites go through on dry ground. Now, the other part of the story is when the Israelites get to the other side, who's coming behind them? Pharaoh, because Pharaoh, even though he lets them go, his heart is hardened again. So he begins to chase them. And when they get into the middle of the dry ground and the walls of the water are pushed up, what happens? God said they collapse and it kills every one of them. Now here's an interesting thing theologians argue about. Well, it was really not that deep. You may hear this. It was really not that deep of water. It was really not this, or, how could that happen? It was a shallow end of the Red Sea. Well, I think that makes it even more amazing, because if it wasn't but 6 inches of water there, then God parted that makes it more amazing. He's going to kill a whole army of chariots and all these soldiers and horses with 6 inches of water rate making it up. Let's even put it into a little bit more details. What if it was just a dab? Just touched their toes in it. Well, that's even more miraculous. So regardless of what you think, God caused that to part. He caused the Israelites, He led them through on dry ground, and then the water that was there collapsed over the Egyptians and killed every one of them. Why was that happen? Because God's power is revealed. Then we come into chapter 6, or session 6, and the title of that is Provision Given, how God provides for His people's needs. Now, you're going to hear about this, and as you read through it, you're going to see where the people begin to complain. And as they begin to complain, as they're walking out of Egypt, some of them said that, well, we wish we'd have been back there. I like your introduction, but I'm not going to read the whole thing, because it gave the script. Many of you remember this about who's on first, what's on second, who's on third, and all that. Rather than go through that, I like the last sentence of that on page 55. It says, in this week's Bible study, God worked in such a way that left no question for who He is and what He can do. Another introduction to that might be simply put this way. As we read it, we can find that this lesson can be good for everybody. Every person who is God's follower. Every person who is faithful to God. And as we look at it, we can understand that sometimes worry turns to anxiety. And you ever worry about anything? You ever really have problems? And that many times anxiety turns into panic. And from there, as long as we have a loving Heavenly Father, there's no need for us to worry, because the anxious, or to be anxious, or to be even panicky. So, in one sense, this lesson allows us the assurance that God is still there and He still provides for His people. Now, understand that they had crossed the Red Sea. The people are there, and they're there, and there's a celebratory song that Moses sang after they had crossed the Red Sea, he and the people of Israel. And here's the way it went in Exodus 15:13. With your faithful love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. You will guide them to your holy dwelling with your strength. They are thinking that immediately when they cross the Red Sea, and I can imagine this, they're thinking that everything's going to be okay. There's not going to be any problems. There's not going to be any issues for me to deal with. Life's going to be simple, and God's just going to supply all our needs. Well, little did they know that they would walk through the wilderness for how many years? 40 years. And why did they do that? Because of their rebelliousness or their sin against God. Every time that God would tell them to do something, either they would reject and go the opposite way. Boy, isn't that familiar with us today? That's exactly what we do. So here's what we can understand is that if we are redeemed, if we are rescued by Christ, rescued by God, we can count on Him leading us. There's no doubt He will do that. But also, He places us where He wants us to be. And His presence is always with us. Have you ever wondered why you were somewhere at a certain time, in a certain place, and things happen or either don't happen? Like, why was I here? Or why wasn't I there? I'm sure that question has been asked here lately with some of the people that were not in New Orleans or either did make it to New Orleans and the tragedy that happened there. Well, everyone, if we're submissive to God, can be led by His Spirit if we are submissive to Him, if we're faithful to Him. But more importantly, we have to understand that really in life, for us to be fulfilled and for us to reach complete satisfaction of who we need to be and be faithful, our faithfulness can bring satisfaction from God, because God is the one that provides that satisfaction. So here's a few things I've written down for this, is that first of all, before we get in to read the Scripture, is that Israel was only beginning to learn what the Lord was and about His ways. They were just beginning to learn. Why? Because for 400 years they had been where? In bondage, in slavery. Imagine this, is that for 400 years you were taken into bondage or slavery as a nation, and all of a sudden you're given your freedom. What do? Well, they had seen God rescue them from Egypt. They had seen God miraculously deliver them from the Egyptian army. How? Because of the Red Sea collapsing on them and bringing them out of Egypt. But now we find in this lesson that their needs were different. This mighty rescuer, as our author calls Him, which is God Himself, and our mighty Redeemer, as some of the Israelites referred to Him as, is He really concerned about us? Because here we are in this foreign land. We're across the sea. We can't go back. We can't go around. The Egyptian army is dead. If we go back now, it's disastrous for us. And so they begin to